Good morning and welcome. I'm Rich Gordon, a member of the California State Assembly, representing the 24th Assembly District. This education forum is being televised and recorded, so I want to thank the folks at Mid-Peninsula Television for that, and also as I welcome folks here in the room, welcome folks who are watching or who will watch the broadcast of this forum. I'm in my final month as a member of the State Assembly, and thank you. It's been an honor and a privilege to represent this area and to, over the course of the past 6 years, on a periodic basis, to host these education forums. We've had interesting discussions in the past about education budget and funding and financing, the local control funding formula. Most recently, we had a very enlightening conversation about teacher recruitment and retention. Today, our focus is going to be on early childhood education. And I want to thank three people who have joined me. I'll introduce them in a moment, but in more depth. Speaker Anthony Rendon from the California State Assembly, Kathy Betcher, Executive Director of Children World, and Ted Lempert, who is the CEO, President of Children Now. I think the evidence is pretty clear. We know that early childhood education makes a difference. We have learned so much in our recent history about the impacts and effects of early brain development. And we know how much of the brain is developed in these very early years. And so, study after study shows us that children who have early stimulation, early education, do better throughout school, do better throughout life. It's just that simple. And yet, here in America, we remain one of the countries in the world with the lowest rate of early childhood education in the world. We just do not provide any kind of universal early childhood education as is done in so many other places in the world. And it has an impact on all of us and in our communities by not providing this type of education. So today, I'm hoping that one of the things that we can explore is how do we move the needle? How do we get to the place where California can begin to embrace the concept that all children should receive education at a much earlier age? How do we deliver that? How do we provide it? How eventually will we pay for it? And how will we convince others of how important this is, those who do not yet understand or see the value of early childhood education? I've asked each of my guests to make some brief opening comments. We'll then engage in some discussion, and we will have time as part of our program today for questions from the audience, and there'll be an opportunity for you to ask questions of our panelists. So I'm going to start with my good friend and current colleague, Speaker Anthony Rendon. Anthony represents the 63rd Assembly District. That's 9 cities in Los Angeles County. He earlier this year, on March 7th, was sworn in as the 70th Speaker of the State Assembly. I think what's most interesting is prior to his election to the State Assembly, Mr. Rendon has served as an educator, a nonprofit executive director, and an environmental activist. Most recently, he was the executive director of Plaza de la Raza Child Development Services. Plaza de la Raza provides comprehensive child development and social and medical services to over 2,300 children and families in 35 different sites in Los Angeles County. So clearly someone who comes to the state legislature with a background and an interest in early childhood education. And with that, Speaker Rendon.
Thank you. Thank you and good morning. If you were booing and moaning that Rich is termed out, I'm I'm crying. Rich has been a great friend and a wonderful colleague and someone who I've depended on whether it was issues of public policy or just sort of advice in the building. So you're quite fortunate to have been represented by him for the past 6 years. I'm just as fortunate to call him a friend and a colleague. And thank you, Rich, for putting this together. This is, as Rich said in his introduction, I'm an early childhood educator. I worked in early childhood education, federally funded Head Start, state infants and toddler, and state preschool, state child care for 20 years prior to running for office. And I really decided to run for office because of cuts to early childhood education. When I first Rich mentioned my last executive director position in early childhood education. My first day on that job was on January 27th, 2008. And one of the programs that I was running was reimbursed on that day at $31 per child per day. 2.5 years later, on June 30th, 2010, that same program that had been funded at $31 per child per day was funded at $17 per child per day because of the draconian cuts to early childhood education. Now keep in mind, we were still responsible for educating the same number of children. We still had a mandate to have the same child-to-teacher ratio. We were still paying the same rents, and we still had the same collective bargaining agreement. So those cuts had a significant impact on the direct services that were provided to children, a lot of the ancillary services that were provided to children. And when I went to Sacramento and I went to DC and I asked folks why this program that I knew was changing children's lives, why it was being cut, I really didn't like the answers that I received. There weren't enough Rich Gordons there at the time. And that's why I decided to run for office. State Assembly was the first office I ever ran for, and I ran on an early childhood education platform and as a social service provider. And so for me, this past year was something that was sort of the pinnacle thus far of my career, when you run for office because of $1.2 billion in cuts to early childhood education, and then you serve as a member and as speaker when we reinvest $530 million in early childhood education. It really is, for us and for me personally, it was a great year, and it was the start of us beginning to reinvest in our children. That being said, let's keep in mind that when we had, prior to the $1.2 billion cuts in early childhood education, I still, despite the fact that we were helping thousands and thousands of kids on a daily basis, we still had, in my program, waiting lists of hundreds and hundreds of children. And we know that the state has grown. We know we have a population of 38.5 million people. So when we, prior to having $1.2 billion in cuts, we didn't have enough funding. Now that we've restored some of that funding, we're still quite far behind where we need to be. That being said, we are making significant progress, and it's because of legislators like Rich who articulated really the need for the programs. And Rich talked about the brain development that occurs in early childhood education. 90% of development in the human brain happens between birth and when a child is 5 years old. And if we miss out on those opportunities, then we are really missing out on a golden opportunity to sort of to make sure that we have the educational opportunities that we can that children need. What was interesting this morning, we were pulling into town, and there seems to be a university here nearby. I was thinking. In my early childhood education experiences, I used to spend a lot of time at UNC Chapel Hill. UNC Chapel Hill is a fantastic, they have great barbecue, but they also have a great early childhood education program at I think it's called the Center for the Whole Child. And I used to go about 2 or 3 times a year to get certified. I was ECHRS certified and FECHRS certified and all that. So yay, people are nodding their heads. I'm home. I used to go 2 or 3 times a year to be certified in different elements of early childhood education. And what was neat about sort of becoming really familiar with Chapel Hill was the extent to which you realize that their K through 12 education system was great, and you realize it's home to this fantastic university, and then it's home to this great sort of economic engine for the South, the sort of research triangle. And then about a month ago, I spent about a week in Cambridge at the Center for Child and the Society at Harvard. With Dr. Schwarzkopf, who I'm sure you all know. And what was interesting about that is you have the same sort of dynamic. You have this incredible early childhood education center, which eventually leads, and if you've been reading quite a bit about what's happening in the Boston public schools, it's really miraculous, leads into this fantastic university system, and then you have this great technology hub that has become Boston. If you start to think about the extent to which there are certain parts of our country and indeed certain parts of our world that are really looking at cradle to career education, you can see this sort of continuity in places such as those. And we need to make sure that in California we do that as well, that we do not isolate that even when we begin to start funding our K through 12, our early childhood education funding, when we start refunding it at exceptionally high levels, that we don't sort of leave all of our best education efforts there. For me, one of the most depressing parts of federally funded Head Start programs as a program director was the fact that we would have these great, we would have a great curriculum, we would have great child to teacher ratios, we would have great parental involvement components, and then I would know that in a lot of instances in East and Southeast Los Angeles where my program was being offered, that these children were going to go into kindergarten and go into schools that were not funded at the levels they should have been, and where the quality of education wasn't what it should have been, and where parental involvement was virtually non-existent. So early childhood education is an absolutely essential part of our overall educational process, our educational program, but we need to make sure that it is, though an important step, that it is just a first step.
Great, thank you. Next, let me introduce Ted Lempert. Ted is the president of Children Now, a national research and advocacy organization that most of you know. Ted and I have, throughout our career, ping-ponged back and forth in various elected offices. I served initially on the San Mateo County Board of Education. Ted currently serves on the San Mateo County Board of Education. When Ted left the San Mateo County Board of Supervisors to go to the State Assembly, I followed and went to the San Mateo County Board of Supervisors. And now I'm in the Assembly. Ted and I have been friends for a long time. He is just an outstanding advocate for children, and we're fortunate to have him with us today. Ted?
Well, thank you very much, Rich. And let me just start by sharing the speaker's tears that you're going to be leaving the State Assembly. Since you mentioned our history, I remember at a public event saying when you took my place on the County Board of Supervisors that I had the feeling you would be the best supervisor this county ever had, and I was proven right. And then when you went on to the Assembly, predicting you would be one of the great representatives, not just for this area, but the state, and you've certainly proven that. And we're going to miss you a great deal, although we were chatting beforehand. I don't imagine this guy ever retiring, so we look forward to you staying involved and being a leader in many great ways. And the other thing you've done is you've left the Assembly in good hands, and I just want to say for a moment, personally and as a child advocate and running Children Now, how thrilled we are that the Assembly has elected this new speaker. I served with 4 speakers when I was in the Assembly, and nothing against them, including a outspoken former mayor and a guy who might be running for governor, but this speaker gets it, and just his leadership this year for early childhood. And I can't tell you, as a child advocate, me and my team, when we talk to folks in Sacramento, to go to the leader of the Assembly and have him know these issues, the details, and the passion is just incredible. So no pressure, but we're looking to Too. It's truly extraordinary. I feel so positive about the legislature and look forward to you being speaker for a long time and your leadership. I just want to start for just one sec talking about K-12, and there is a reason I'm going to do that as it relates to early childhood. As many of you know, I've been involved in K-12 work, and Children Now is heavily involved in K-12 work as well. And one of the reasons we push so hard for the local control funding formula and are now working on all the implementation challenges is because we saw so many disparities, and we know that English language learners, foster care kids, kids in poverty need more support. And what the local control funding formula does, if you read the bill, is really focused on that equity principle and really getting more support for kids. And then efforts around school-based health, making sure we have strong accountability, so local districts have to make sure that every kid is being supported. We do all that because we know there's deep inequities in our K-12 education system. And I say that because even though there are those deep inequities, it's nothing compared to the birth to 5 world. Because at least in K-12, at the least funded school, at least that kid is getting some education and there's some support and we have a baseline. In the birth to 5 world, and Rich and Anthony explained so strongly how important these years are, you have literally hundreds of thousands, not millions of kids in this state who are getting nothing, why some kids, including a lot of kids in this town, in this area, are getting extraordinary services prenatal to age 5. And I'm sure there's folks here, and I have 3 kids, and I'm still paying off that they're now, a couple are in college. They spend tens of thousands of dollars in those early years making sure that their kids have exceptional early education experiences. And if they have a health issue, making sure they get all the support they need. So some kids are getting an extraordinary amount in those early years. And a recognition that, yes, it's the parent and the family, but high-income families are contracting out for professional experience support because they know they can't do it alone. They need really well-trained professionals to help them in those early years. And yet, so many families in this area throughout the state don't have anything. So that's why this issue is so critical, because as been described, so much is determined in those early years. And it's not that someone that doesn't get early childhood support can't ultimately do well, but the statistics and the research shows that it's a big climb, and that it's that by kindergarten, a lot of a child's development and support is already determined. So this really is the issue of our time, which is why we're so thrilled with the Rich's and the speaker's leadership. And I'm really hoping over the next 5-10 years, California leads the way. So this country, can no longer be behind in early childhood, but ahead. So just a couple real specific things, and then we can get into details in questions. I was asked to just briefly say next 2 years, then 5 years, 10 years. So next 2 years, be careful, this is televised, but let's just say that the current governor does not share the speaker's understanding and passion for this issue. So I think in the next 2 years, we just need to keep the pressure on, build off the great win from this year, and ensure that those dollars come through. A lot of what was driving the legislature's leadership on this issue this year is with the new minimum wage laws. I mean, there were a lot of child care providers that couldn't pay their providers minimum wage, and part of the effort to improve reimbursement rates is just so folks who are dealing with our kids in the most important years get paid minimum wage. Even with the victory this year, we're still behind 2008 enrollment, and only 9% of eligible infants and toddlers are currently served by subsidized program. And finally, one of the great things we've done in this in the last few years is sort of break down this divide between infant, toddler, and preschool. And so while there's been a lot of focus appropriately on infant, toddler, these preschool years are absolutely critical as well, and we're still not there in making sure that every kid, and especially every low-income kid, has access to high-quality preschool. And so in the next 2 years, we need to continue pushing towards some of the commitments that the governor and legislature have made. And foster youth, there's a special need to make sure that foster families have access to child care, and that's an issue I think we can make some great progress on in the next 2 years. as well as quality rating systems. And San Mateo and Santa Clara counties have been leaders locally on developing what could quality look like and taking that and applying it to the state level. Then there will be a new governor, which we'll need to make sure they get this issue and are a leader. And that will really be an opportunity to further the progress, really look at rate restructuring and making sure that we're looking at regional variations, and that's especially critical in a high-cost area like here. Really get to the promise of preschool, not just for 4-year-olds, but when you look at infant, toddler, and preschool for 4-year-olds, the age that we need to make sure we're focused on is age 3. It's almost like in the K-12 world, we sometimes forget those critical middle school years and don't put the real important support there. In the birth to 5 space, are 3-year-olds in the infant toddler, or are they in the preschool? And I think what you see is really you need that preschool experience as young as 3. So really building towards making sure all 3 and 4-year-olds have access to quality preschool. And then an issue that I know there's great progress going on here and in LA County, building a kindergarten readiness a statewide kindergarten readiness system, so we can really see how kids are doing when they get into kindergarten, see where the gaps are, and really have a statewide snapshot. And hopefully all that could be done in the first couple years of a new gubernatorial administration. Then long-term. Long-term, very simply, I'd love to see every kid in this state has to have access to what the highest income families in this area have. Because if we're serious about equal opportunity, then any infant toddler should have access, if they wanted, to high quality childcare, whether it's home-based, in a home-based setting, center-based setting. We need to ensure that access. And we've focused so much on inequality and poverty in our society. The thing about childcare, it's a twofer, right? It provides support for the parent. We were talking about the mom to work, so deals with poverty right now, but then because of what we know about brain development and supports, it's also the way to really ensure we don't have this inequality in poverty rates 20 years from now. So when we talk about what do we do about the deep poverty in this state, one of the immediate and twofer answers is childcare, so making sure that all kids have access. And then the two last things I'd highlight is, just like in K-12, a huge challenge is not just the education piece, but where are the school nurses that I had when I was in public school 20 miles from here? I mean, I went to a little public school pre-Prop 13, and we had a school nurse for our little school and lots of caring adults on campus and screenings for all the supports that were needed. And today, it's many years later, we don't have that support in just about any school. So you need that in K through 12, but especially in early childhood, we need to focus on the health supports and social supports as well. So hopefully long-term, every family has access to quality voluntary home visiting programs, and not just that we screen our kids and make sure every kid's getting the required developmental screenings, but then has access to interventions that are needed. And lastly, just sort of break down this divide between birth to 5 and K through 12. I know there's some great K through 12 leaders here, and I think if we could have redesigned this system from if we were in the New Deal, right, and way back then, and knew how important early childhood was, I think you would have seen early childhood not only better funded, because we struggle today with more limited government resources, but recognizing this birth to 5 is where we really need billions and billions of dollars. But we also probably wouldn't have created this break, that it starts at kindergarten, and instead say education support starts at birth, quite frankly, prenatal, and we need a system that continues through, and recognizing that in a way, really the most important time for services is the early years. So K through 12 leaders who get it, but in Sacramento, and I think two here might agree with this, what we've seen as an advocate is K through 12 leaders locally get it, but then when we go and push the legislature for funding for early childhood, the K through 12 education associations behind the scenes are saying, can't do that. Don't give money to early childhood. We got to figure out a way where the K through 12 and birth to 5 worlds are coming together and say, what do kids need? And breaking down these silos and really getting very, very strong support for early childhood. So I'm very hopeful about the future, and am just honored to be here, Rich. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Ted. Next, let me introduce Kathy Bedrick. Kathy has been working in the early care and education field for 40 years. She served as a teacher, an administrator, a curriculum specialist, a program director, a deputy director, and currently is the executive director at California Young World. Kathy also is a consultant, providing advice to others in the education field and early childhood education and management issues. And she has also served in Santa Clara County on the First Five Commission and was chair of that commission at one point. So Kathy, welcome. Glad to have you here.
Thank you. So I've had a great foundation laid for me this morning. I don't have to use all of my talking points because a lot has been said already. I'm definitely the perspective of the boots on the ground. Every day, 12 hours a day, I operate 3 child development centers in Sunnyvale, just about 10, 15 miles down 101 here in Santa Clara County. And like Rich said, I've been working in the early childhood field for 40 years, so I've certainly seen a lot of changes. I'm very aware of those daily reimbursable rates that Assemblyman Rendon talked about. I've been through the 17 and the 21 and we're now at 38. And come January, we're going to be at 42, which is very exciting, but it costs about $65 a day to care for a child. So we're still about $20 a day, a child, below what it really costs. I run a blended program, which means half of my children are under a contract with the California Department of Education where we get that $42 a day, or we will, starting in January. The rest of my families are what we call full cost. They write a check every week or every month for their child care, paying me as much as $1,850 a month for infant and toddler care and $1,320 a month for a preschooler. And I have a waiting list, and I'm full. So this is not above the market rate. This is what it costs in Sunnyvale. But the state pays us about $800 a month for a preschooler. So I lose about $400 or $500 a month per child by giving that seat to a subsidized child, because it's part of our mission to make sure that we not only provide services to the at-risk community, but that we provide a blended, diverse population so our children can grow up in an environment where they understand diversity, they have empathy for others, they understand differences, they grow up with that perspective, so they think no differently when they become an adult. So with that said, I just would like to focus on 3 areas in my 40 years of operating child development centers. The workforce issue that we have 24 to 2,600 licensed center-based programs in Santa Clara County at any given time. And the pool of qualified early childhood educators is so small that we are forced to hire folks who really need a lot more educational development before they should be working with children. So that burden falls to us, the employer, to make sure that we get that providing professional development to our educators, and that it's at our cost. Because often we're paying people $11 to $13 an hour to care for children. They can't afford even the community college rates. My first point is that I think we really need a bit of a paradigm shift in our community that really tries to address the issue that an early childhood education career is credible, it's viable, the rates of pay for some of the upper level positions are something that someone can survive at, because we've been spending the last 10 to 15 years with a program called CARES to reimburse folks to go to school and get their bachelor's degrees and master's degrees. So now a lot of our staff are at the same level as the folks working in the K-12 system, but a lot of times once our staff get to that level of education, they move on into the K-12. And of course with TK, the last few years, we've lost a lot of the people that used to work in early childhood because they can get a higher pay and probably better benefits. So I remember back in the 70s, as I was just starting my career, there was a big push from the national government to get people to go into teaching. And we'll pay for your credential and your education as long as you work a couple of years in a really blighted neighborhood to pay back the government for paying for their education. I would love to see something like this happen again, but for early childhood. We do some local initiatives to reimburse people for their TK classes that they need or to get a degree, but it's always a tiny little cohort, and it's sponsored by a First Five grant or a Packard grant. And so it's a very micro level initiative. What we need is something huge in our state. My second point is that in Santa Clara County, we've spent several years developing a early childhood education master plan. And when people talk about what is it we need to do, everything we need to do is in that plan. So I would encourage everyone and anyone who is leadership in Santa Clara County to not reinvent the wheel, to pull out that Santa Clara County master plan. It's something that the County Office of Education, under the leadership of Don Bolts, and of course the superintendent, they are pushing the initiative to pull out the master plan, look at it, and take the next step. We set 7-year goals 7 years ago. So now we're ready to pull that out and look at what we've accomplished and set another set of goals for us. My last point is the issue of where we put the children. Something I've been passionate about for the last 20 years is facility development in early childhood education. And I was very lucky to be selected to be part of a group called LINK, Local Investment in Child Care, that was funded by a Packard grant in 1998. The money ran out 10 years ago, but the group continues to meet in about 4 or 5 different counties. We're really working hard to try to identify what is a quality facility, what it will cost to develop facilities, what it would cost to renovate facilities. You can't just go into a commercial space that hasn't been occupied for a very long time and convert it into a child development center. It just doesn't work that way. There are so many impediments from the city, the county, and the state in regards to permits, zoning, licensing, bathrooms. I mean, the list is so overwhelming that operators and owners have no interest in coming in and spending $250,000 before they can even put a child in their center. A lot of operators are happy to carry some debt in the way of a mortgage, but they can't also pay for the pre-development and the construction part of putting a facility together. We all pay rent, and that rent could be a lovely mortgage payment for an operation, but we just don't have the resources to be able to do it all. So we need some support in our state to be able to provide innovative strategies. Right now we have the Revolving Fund, that is a 0% loan fund, but it's restricted to portables and modular units, which we know as operators have a 10 to 15, 20-year shelf life. We want a building, bricks and mortar, that we can be in for 40 years, or if we leave, another provider can come in and provide those services. So we have some excellent teachers, but the pool is very, very small. We need a bit of a paradigm shift to get folks aware of what we need to do to make things change. We have the master plan, which is already a very established document that we can use. We also have some wonderful examples of the progress that we've made, the articulation project, the alignment of community colleges, making sure that if someone takes a class at Mission and then they also take a class at Gavilan, now those 2 classes are going to have the same value instead of, oh, you took that at Gavilan, that doesn't really count. But you took it at Mission, that's really good. So now everything is kind of being aligned across Santa Clara County, at least. It's a California initiative, but we're really working in Santa Clara County to make that happen. And then, of course, we live in Silicon Valley, where we have unbelievable resources when it comes to electronic abilities to improve our tracking ability, improve our articulation between the K-12 world and the early childhood world, our ability to give children unique identifiers as young as infancy so we can track their progress all the way through school. Children typically get that unique identifier when they enter kindergarten, but we've had some pilot programs where we've given children unique identifiers earlier, so we're able to really track the data of the progress that we're making. And then, of course, both of my colleagues talked about the articulation. We used to say, is early childhood preparing children for school? And now we have best practice research that says, yes, we are. The work that we've been doing in the last 20 years is preparing children for school. But now the problem is, are the schools ready to receive our children? And how much do they regress before they get to third grade from how prepared we were when we got them started in the program? So I'm really passionate about those 3 items, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Great, thank you, Kathy. I'm going to take the prerogative of starting the Q&A. We'll turn it to the audience in a minute. But Mr. Speaker, my thought about the significant increase in funding that we got last year in the legislature was there was a driver around the minimum wage increase that I think had an impact in helping us get that. What's the next driver? How do we continue to move the needle in Sacramento for funding for these programs?
You're right, Rich. The minimum wage was a significant driver. I believe the sort of sequence, they were about a month apart, the vote on the minimum wage and then the vote on the budget with respect to ECE. I think there's a few drivers. I mean, first of all, good old-fashioned politics. I mean, good old-fashioned advocacy. When my first sort of entree into politics was going to a budget sub 1 hearing, maybe when Gray Davis was governor. And what was interesting about that hearing was that as an early childhood education provider, I remember we didn't quite have our act together. I remember, the different advocacy groups would kind of go up as one and present their case and talk about their issues. And then the ECE folks, we'd kind of saunter up and, like, do you want to talk? I don't know, you want to talk? And we all had sort of different uncoordinated arguments. And it was Holly Mitchell was the first early childhood education provider I knew who ran for office. I ran. Susan Bonilla, Assemblymember Bonilla, has been a great advocate. Most recently, Kevin McCarty. And in this past year, it was the Women's Caucus. It was the leadership of Assemblymember Christina Garcia, Senator Hannah Beth Jackson, who were really talking about the importance of early childhood education. So I think to a large extent, that was a big driver. But Ted did mention the gubernatorial election that we're going to have. And what's kind of interesting is as we've developed politically as a field, ECE has kind of become more politicized. The idea of making sure that ECE is on the agenda and a central component of the debate around who should be the next governor and who understands this and how important it is really that conversation is starting to happen. So I think from a political standpoint, it really is this tremendous advocacy on behalf of parents and ECE folks. But also, we recently celebrated the 40th or 50th. I think it was the 50th anniversary of Head Start. And there's a significant amount of research out there. University of Michigan, University of Wisconsin, these great studies on the impact of early childhood education and brain development. And I think that is starting to take root too, and that'll be a big driver as well.
So Ted, Speaker talks about the role of advocacy. How do we find other partners to work with us, and who should those partners be, so that it's not just those of us who are often seen as the bleeding hearts for young children? How do we engage others?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I was so glad to hear the speaker talk about the maturation of the field, because when I was at First at Children, our former colleagues would call and say, well, one early childhood group came in to say something, and then the next group would come in and not only say something different, but badmouth the group that came. But before, I was like, and we still have a ways to go, but I think the two of you would agree that the early childhood field has gotten its act together a lot more, and we've actually able to bring together folks for a common ask, which I know is helpful to champions. But to your question, we work very closely with the providers and all the provider groups throughout the state. But the problem with the providers being the only advocates is people say, well, of course you want more. And so I think what we really need to do is bring a whole range of other folks. And there's folks in this room that embody that. Religious congregations in this area, business leaders, community leaders. And so this is an issue that the whole community can come around. And so this should not be an early childhood provider issue. This should be everyone. The other piece of that too is just, again, I would emphasize the need for K through 12 leaders to step up. So, one of the things we've been working with folks locally is to leverage the local control funding formula for early childhood. In some cases, like in Eastside Union and some other districts, that's been actual dollars for early childhood. And that would be great in many areas, but also districts throughout the state saying we need more early childhood, and school superintendents and school board leaders and educators coming together. So it's really everyone, and I would single out in this area the business community, at SAMCETA, Silicon Valley Leadership Group, SV2, so many business groups have really helped, and that advocacy has made a difference in Sacramento.
Kathy, you talked about some of the challenges that the field faces, workforce development, facilities. Given some of those challenges, is it possible for us to get to some kind of universal early childhood education?
Absolutely. We've seen it in smaller pilot projects, and I think certainly it can be expanded for much bigger regional and statewide initiatives. An example of this is that I've been working 20 years on facility development, and after one meeting with the Strong Start Facility Committee, we are at a point of where we have gotten to in 20 years after one meeting, just because the people at the table are business, corporate, really high level involved folks, as opposed to just the early childhood community coming together. And what Ted talks about is one group would come and be really passionate about this, and another group would come and talk about this. I think the Strong Start Collaborative is helping us really put a real comprehensive look to our field and everything that we need to do in order to make it happen. So yes, I think the master plan talks about what we could do for children programmatically, and Strong Start is working on a lot of things that need to happen structurally and system-wide, and trying to really look at bond measures or large amounts of money to tackle that facilities issue. And so I'm just so excited that I'm usually the one on this side of the table trying to tell folks what we need, and I'm now being able to share my voice with folks that can really help make some decisions and make some progress in our field.
Great, thank you. I'm going to open this up for questions from the audience. And Leslie and my staff has got a microphone. We'll bring that to you because we need to get your voice heard for the broadcast. Thank you.
I'm actually part of the Strong Start Committee as well. And your name? I'm Diane Foote, and I'm with PTA. I also want to say, I think having the legislature fund TK this year also had to help early childhood education. And I'm just wondering if there's any chance that that could be made permanent, and a permanent funding, if that wouldn't help early childhood education in a lot of ways.
Maybe to the speaker, and then I'd also like to hear from Ted about the role that TK's played.
I think I just heard the governor groan at your question. It would be great. And I would be fully in favor of it. I think the Women's Caucus has spoken to that as well. I think politically it would be easier if we could find maybe a dedicated source of funding to do so. But again, I talked earlier about running a high quality early childhood education program in a community where the K through 12 schools were not what they should have been, and that disconnect for me was always one that troubled me. So it's something that I think would be wonderful.
Ted, how do you see the role that TK's played in this movement around early childhood education?
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with the speaker, and then the only downside of the TK is it should really be the full year, not just a cohort. But I'll say one other thing that we used to say in our advocacy meetings behind closed doors, and now I'm very happy saying publicly, and that is, we really need to get 4-year-olds in LEAs, or the public school system, so every kid has access, and it really should be through the public school system. The reason that hasn't happened, and you can ask Rob Reiner and you can ask Daryl Steinberg, is because the childcare community appropriately said, if you take the 4-year-olds out, we lose our economics. We can't run these centers with just the infant toddlers. So we should just be straightforward about that and say, rather than pit against each other, let's figure out really sustainable financing and support for infant toddler. And then, TK, all 4-year-olds should, we feel, be in a, not necessarily in quote public schools, but in a public school run dynamic so that it's full access and universal.
Hi, I'm David Fleischman with 4Cs of San Mateo County. I'd like to thank you all for being here, your comments, and the great work in the field. I'm especially appreciative to hear the talk about infants and toddlers. Speaker Rendon mentioned that up to 90% of the brain is developed by age 5. Up to 85% is developed by age 3. So say what you will about the diminishing returns on aging, but it does speak to the importance of getting to those kids at the earliest time. My question has to do with cost. And so much of it comes down to paying for it, as so many of the comments centered on today. And Assembly Member Gordon, thank you for the subsidy pilot, which has helped us spend our money and use our subsidy dollars to a much fuller extent. So I was just wondering if anyone had any secrets about building a partnership or strong relationship with the Department of Finance, who we so often run up against in terms, the keepers of the money. And is it just waiting out 2 years and having a new Department of Finance, or what can we do in the meantime to help align ourselves better with them?
Well, I'll start. I think earlier Ted was talking about the Silicon Valley Leadership Group and their advocacy for ECE in Los Angeles. I think it was 2 years ago, the Los Angeles Chamber of Commerce talked about, they had 3 priorities. Believe the first was infrastructure, the second was something else. I don't remember remember what it was. And the third was expanded ECE funding. And I think a lot of folks in the business community are starting to get it, and a lot of folks in the business community are starting to get the economics of it. And to a large extent, if you think about places, I was a couple of nights ago, there's a presidential election you may have heard of. I was watching the news. The reddest state in the United States is Oklahoma. And what's interesting is that in Oklahoma, their Republican-led governor has been a great advocate for ECE, continually making an economic argument for ECE, over and over again, making an economic argument. One of the things that I learned from Dr. Schwarenkoff at Harvard was that he said we continually talk about the savings when we talk about savings related, the economics of ECE. We often talk about the savings relating to the corrections institutions and other places like that. He said we often forget to talk about health, the health savings associated. And having run a Head Start component where you have an oral health component, where you have early screenings for early onset in the Latino community, where I work, the early onset of diabetes, early onset of obesity, and everything related to that, you start to think about the savings on those levels. It really kind of multiplies, and the economics starts to make even more sense.
Rich, just a really quick thing on the Department of Finance, and I'm saying this because you have the opportunity with the speaker sitting here, and I know all the gubernatorial candidates talk to him. Under this administration, the Department of Finance has also led policy, which I think has been really a problem for kids. The 4 governors before this governor had an office of education, which also focused on early childhood. So I hope the next governor has a staff that focuses on these issues. So, because as advocates, we've had to deal with the Department of Finance on the policy side, and they should be on the number side. So that's one area. But the one other thing is just say that Advocacy 101 is inside champions, and they're unbelievably right here, outside champions. And you know, one of the sophisticated things that advocacy is now doing is going directly. So the head of the Department of Finance had our letter with 480 groups in front of him when I was on the phone with him. So we're getting there. I mean, it's really just trying to provide more sophisticated advocacy to support the, you know, incredible champions we have on the inside.
So my name is Ellen Wheeler. I'm on the school board in Mountain View Westman School District. I'm also here for League of Women Voters and Strong Start. I want to dig a little deeper. And we've talked about the developmental and health needs of young children and a little bit about the academics. We know that early words, early language development is so important. And now we're starting to hear more about the importance of early math for young children. I'm wondering if Speaker Rendon or Ms. Betcher can tell us a little bit about that.
Sure, absolutely. And in fact, just recently, one of the last meetings I went to, they talked about not changing our focus, but adding early math literacy to the early emerging literacy issues, because we've always focused so much on how many second language learners that we have in our area. But now we're identifying that math has almost an even bigger influence, that if children are more competent when they start kindergarten, they're more successful by the age of 8 when they're in 3rd grade. They've got strong math skills and, of course, strong literacy skills. It's an indication of future success in education. So absolutely, but I think a big piece of that is family engagement, and the fact that we need to include our parents in that. I know we've got some great examples of Parent University and such going on in different school districts to bring parents to the table. But I think in early childhood, we know that the quicker we get parents engaged in their child's education journey, it's a little less intimidating in the early childhood field because they're coming to potlucks and fun game nights and family nights. It's a little less intimidating to get involved. But once they're involved and we have their ear, we can present workshops in advocacy, what they should be looking for in education, what they should be expecting of their K-12 system, how to get involved in their K-12 system so that they hit the ground running in kindergarten. We do parent-teacher conferences, we do assessments of children, just like the K-12 system. And so the earlier we can get the parents involved and understand that math is just as important as reading to their children, we're going to get that continuity of what happens during the day at early childhood and the reinforcement of it at what happens at night in the home or on the weekends.
Hello, my name is Harvey Schloss, and before I ask the question, I represent Congregation Beth Am in Los Altos Hills. So we are one of the people that Ted talked about. We are trying to build a faith coalition that is behind early care and learning. I also sit on the Strong Start Coalition and on the local planning council in San Mateo County. 2 questions. One is, I mean, this is all advocacy. We seem to have to do 2 things. One, we have to get over the issue that good things cost money and that nothing's free. But once we get over that, assuming we actually can, how do we change the priorities in the state? What do we need to do to make early learning and early care a real priority? How do we muscle up for this? And what do we have to do to make it work?
Well, as someone who is not running for office again, at some point, we clearly have to tackle a tax system that doesn't work. Prop 13. You know? you know, there's got to be a way to provide folks with assurance of what their property tax bills will be, a guarantee that folks are not priced out of their homes due to property tax, but to have property tax play a greater role in the provision of our tax system. And the reliance that we have on income tax and corporate capital gains creates a dynamic of volatility in our tax structure, which is very, very difficult for a legislature to handle. So at some point, the tax structure will have to be adjusted. To get the political will to do that and to get there is going to be daunting and maybe almost impossible. But I think part of what we need to do is to do that. The other thing is that you know, I've sat for the last 6 years on the budget committee, and I'm hard pressed to say that the tax dollars that the state spends are being, you know, not spent well. There's an awful lot of needs. There's an awful lot of things that folks want us to take care of in some way. And a lot of constituencies. And, you know, yeah, government can always be better. We could always do a better job. But I think state agencies work hard to deliver what people want. So I'm not sure that it's really an issue of how do we cut up the pie differently. I think we have to grow the pie.
If I could just add on, as someone who is running for office again, Rich is right. We need a bigger pie. We clearly do. What I learned early on, this is the sad reality of politics, sad reality of public policy in California or anywhere else. When I sat in that first budget sub-meeting, however many years ago it was, I realized then what I realize now, that to a large extent, budgetary politics is a zero-sum game. The $530 million that early childhood education received was wonderful for early childhood education, but it meant that other folks did not get a piece of that pie. And unless the pie is bigger, some folks are going to continually be left without. I worked on the water bond 2 years ago. I spent 18 months working on the water bond. We did 18 public hearings from Reading in the north to Coachella in the south. There was a time in my office where everybody in my office did nothing other than work on the water bond for 18 months. We estimated that we probably had then about $90 billion in water infrastructural need in our state. All of that effort, we got $7.25 billion from that bond. So we essentially got about 7% of what we need as a state in terms of water infrastructure. That's just water. You start to think about our road infrastructure, you start to think about our schools infrastructure, you start to think about an entire state that was essentially built for 12 to 13 million people that now has 38.5 million people. It's not just early childhood education, it's everything else that needs to be rebuilt in our state. So I'm all for a bigger pie.
Sort of hard to ask a question after those comments, but my name's Vic Ojakia, and I had two questions. One of them got answered before the meeting, and that was I asked Assemblymember Gordon if this was going to be his last public meeting, and his answer was yes. So instead of you, Rich, going out with a boo, I want to thank you for all your service. Woo. My gosh, I'd say people liked you. My question's for the speaker, though I imagine some of the other speakers would want to weigh in. California had a program, the Early Mental Health Initiative, EMI, and that program was discontinued by this governor. His name seems to keep coming up in regards to certain things. This last year, Assemblymember Bonta had a bill, AB 1644. It was supported by a number of people up and down the state, including Children Now. Folks spoke on behalf of it. That bill was basically going to put $600,000 in place to start early mental health programs with K through 3, so it's a little older than the group we're talking about now. I've spoken with Assemblymember Bonta's legislative director, because that bill, I think, got vetoed by the governor, and he's planning on bringing something back. So what's it going to take to get that either put into the budget process, because of the way this governor operates, or to get it passed by the legislature?
Let me start the response to that question, Vic, and that's that there were multiple pieces of legislation that got to the governor's desk that either restored programs or advocated for new activities that had a price tag associated with it. And universally, the governor vetoed all of those. So he didn't single out this program. And he basically said that he thought these conversations about funding programs and activities are things that need to occur in the budget. So looking ahead, I would think that my colleague, Mr. Bonta, hopefully will look at how do we engage that discussion in a budget committee in the coming year.
Yeah, as usual, Rich is right. And again, just going back to my personal experiences running Head Start and early Head Start especially, we found that the great curriculum and educational opportunities separate from the ancillary services, be they health, oral health, mental health screenings, were really not addressing the whole needs of the child or the whole needs of the family, really. So those types of programs are badly needed. What will it take? Advocacy. Again, the Women's Caucus did an exceptional job of advocating on behalf of ECE funding in general. But as Rich said earlier, that funding, because of the minimum wage increase, was mostly linked to rates. So now to look at some of the complementary or ancillary services, I think is a logical next step.
If I can just add to that, as a provider, we have had, this is probably the area that I feel in my career I have seen the most improvement because of the work that First Five has done, the collaborative spirit of First Five, bringing health and hospital system, mental health, Department of Social Services, the early childhood community, the Santa Clara County Office of Education and Special Education. They have formed a huge collaborative maybe 7-8 years ago. And with the early childhood and the Learning Together initiative with First Five, we now have a system in place in Santa Clara County where early childhood providers that operate centers can call a warm line to get help from the Inclusion Collaborative if they've got a child that has atypical behaviors. We can make referrals to Kids Connection, which is operated out of First Five and Santa Clara County Office of Education and Special Ed, to get early intervention services going for children as young as 6 months of age. As long as those children are Medi-Cal eligible, low income, so all of our subsidized families automatically qualify for this program. And then they also, with some wonderful best practice training programs, have brought information into the early childhood classroom with special education supports. So the emphasis was first to kind of create inclusive environments, but then we found out really quickly that we needed some experts in the early childhood classroom that knew something about special ed. So we're now commingling children so that it's a better environment for them. Peers learn from each other. Parents get to enjoy an environment where their child with special needs is together with a typically developing child, so it helps their development. Oftentimes, we've seen situations where children have received early intervention services that by the time they get to kindergarten, they no longer have a plan. They no longer need those services because the early intervention services that took place before they even got to school have done wonders. And our Inclusion Collaborative in Santa Clara County is now known not only statewide but nationally for the work that we've done in Santa Clara County. And through the Healthier Kids Foundation, all early childhood programs that are part of the quality rating and improvement system can get vision, dental, auditory screenings for all children. So when we're able to do these things every year with our children, we identify these kids much earlier, we bring in the services, and hopefully it's not as much of a burden on the K-12 system. We know as children get older, the services get more and more expensive. So if we can really address these things at a much younger age. So I think Santa Clara County has done a tremendous job. They've got a beautiful model, and other counties in our state should definitely be looking at what's been happening over the last maybe 10, 15 years.
I want to pick up on the point that Kathy Betcher made about parents. Parents of the children at any age involved with the school system. I was a volunteer in East Palo Alto for nearly 20 years. Also go to the big lift meetings and the achievement gap meetings. And I think it was at achievement gap about a year ago, the data on money lost to the district by non-attendance or casual attendance was significant. Absolutely. Really, not to mention the learning lost. And so I want to put the focus, one of our focuses, on parents broadly and the minority community that would learn to trust the system more. How do we do it? I personally think that the media could be doing more, but I also know from personal experience that the one-to-one, and I'm an Anglo, so I'm not that good at it, except occasionally. But the neighbor who has coffee with a neighbor, and one of the big lift programs over on the coast is doing this. I was very impressed to hear about it. It's something to do with the housing development. But one lady is talking to another lady about education for the little kids. And I think we need a lot more of that.
So we want to comment
Thank
on
you.
parental involvement?
Go ahead.
Thanks. I would love to. I love talking about this. And in Head Start, there is a mandatory parental involvement component. In the overwhelmingly immigrant community in Southeast Los Angeles, where I ran my programs, what was so incredible was not only, when you have a parental involvement component, what's amazing is not only the link that's developed between the child and the parent with respect to their education and expectations and involvement in school, but also the link between the parent and the community and the parent and the school system. In the program that I ran, I can think of 3 parents off the top of my head who became involved through Head Start in the community and ended up running for elective office. I know 2 others who got involved through our Head Start programs, through parental involvement, who ended up starting parental advocacy programs in the K through 12 school after they left our programs. So I think it's having a parental involvement component in early childhood education is absolutely the best thing, not only for children, not only for families, but for society and communities at large.
I totally agree with that, but I just want to add one other point. As the dad of 3 kids, as I travel around the state, there's not a parent that doesn't love their kids. Latino parent, and by the way, Latinos are the majority of this state, African American, Asian American. But and so the parent support and the parent responsibility is key. But I just want to tell a quick story. In addition to all his great public service, Rich used to run an amazing nonprofit, Youth and Family Assistant. And it was the first visit I had as a legislator. Rich had me come. And I went around talking to folks. I went up to one young woman and I said, I just got elected to the assembly. What can I do for you? And she looked me straight in the eye and said, please tell my mom's boyfriend to let me come home. And I say that because we need to understand that when we talk about parent responsibility, what is really going on out there? There are tons of kids in this state who are suffering from unbelievable stress that impacts their health on a daily basis. And, you know, the reason I mentioned me having 3 kids is I've got every advantage in the world. It's not easy raising three kids today. And half of our families don't have the income to meet the basics. Over a quarter are in poverty. So I just want to say that because, takes a village, a certain person talks about. Yes, it's parent responsibility, parent support, but, find any high-income parent in this region, they do not do it alone. And so what we need to do is recognize the extraordinary stress that our families are under today and double down and provide, the incredible support that's needed. And and chronic absence is key, but a lot of those kids who aren't showing up at school, we really need to make sure that we've got the support system to find out why and then, get those kids there. And it's going to take an incredible community support to do that.
And if I can just add from the perspective of a provider, we talked about Head Start and the requirement of parents on a parent policy council that help to advise and make decisions. State subsidized programs have the same requirement. It's called a Parent Advisory Committee and parent involvement. And over my 40 years, of course, when we started, we looked at parent involvement and said, try to get them to make Play-Doh at home for you and bring it in, have them come and read stories, have them get involved in the classroom. But over the 40 years I've been in the field, we've really seen an evolution of what parent involvement and parent engagement or family engagement truly is. And that is, we have the child for a year in our classroom. The parents have their children forever. And so you have to teach your caregivers, your providers and teachers, to look at not just caring for the child and developing the child, but really nurturing, developing a relationship and trust with the parents and the family, the siblings, by doing evening activities, by doing game nights, by doing movie nights, parent work days where everybody comes and picks the weeds and chalks the ground for Foursquare and such, so that the parents really learn to take pride in their programs. And again, Parent Advisory Council offers parents that opportunity to become leaders in their early childhood program. And so when they learn to step up and speak up about something that it's a big risk for them, they learn that confidence, so as they get into the K-12 system, they're more inclined to get involved. We try to do this at my program in a bilingual way because we have just as many parents that speak Spanish as we do English. So we provide childcare, we feed them, we provide translation devices, so just like the United Nations, they can hear in any language they want, so that we're not excluding anybody from the practice. And our state is developing programs like Raising a Reader, where they tie family engagement to the literacy program. So a child may take home a book bag, but along with that comes parent workshops to talk about the importance of reading to your child, the importance of cuddling with your child. When you're at home, if your child has done homework at school, take a look at it at home. Talk to your child, is it correct? Check it over. Affirm to your child that they're learning, that they're progressing, that they're doing things. These ideas are very foreign to parents. They think, just get the homework done and then turn it in, where we try to extend that learning a little bit more and encourage them to really get involved in their child's education. And again, hoping that at when their child is 3 to 5, or even with infants and toddlers, they are providing advice and coming to a meeting where they're hearing other parents' perspectives of what they think should be happening at the early childhood program, reaffirming their thoughts or learning new things, so as they do move into K-12, they can step up and repeat that same experience for their child all the way through their education.
Yeah, Michael Garcia. I'm with the local Early Education Planning Council. Before I ask my question, I wanted to recognize and thank Assemblymember Gordon in particular for authoring Assembly Bill 2368, which created a child care pilot subsidy program similar to what we have in other Bay Area counties. So thank you, Assemblymember, for that. My question was focused more around the governor's budget proposal coming up in a couple months. If the past is prologue and the governor's MO, so to speak, is local control, we've seen some form of local control, whether it be realignment, block granting childcare. I know none of us have a crystal ball, but do you foresee that happening? Or Speaker Rendon, I know you commissioned a Blue Ribbon Task Force on ECE. So how do you see that playing out this year?
I'm glad you asked me about my Blue Ribbon Commission. It saves me having to do a commercial later. We did ask, we set up a Blue Ribbon Commission at the end of the budget, particularly for a lot of the reasons we're talking about. We want to make sure that there is not only a vibrant structure for external lobbying to make sure that there's significant ECE funding, but we wanted to make sure that there was a voice within inside of Sacramento to make sure that we keep the pressure on. I think we have something like 15 slots on the Blue Ribbon Commission, about 37,000 applicants thus far. But we're going to make sure there are plenty of avenues for public engagement. And Kevin McCarty, who I mentioned earlier, and Christina Garcia, who I also mentioned earlier, are two of the members who are leading those efforts with us. There were tremendous concerns with some of the block granting ideas that the governor came up with. As you know, as we all know, there are a multitude of opinions within early childhood education about any one thing. The block granting idea that the governor came up with early in the year was something that didn't have a lot of structure around it. He his office sort of threw it out there, and we weren't really sure what it meant. But the fact that it was vague and the fact that the governor has never really been that high on ECE kind of made us a bit skeptical of it, and it was something that kind of he dropped relatively early in the budgetary process. With respect to a crystal ball and what to expect, it's hard to say. I mean, I think the budget was completed in July. We're now at the end of October. If you haven't started advocating for next year's budget, you're late to the game. The advocacy for next year's budget begins the second the budget has signed for the previous year. So I do picture a number of advocates being excited about what we did last year. And it wasn't just the overall funding for early childhood education. The elimination of the maximum family grant, which was a very mean-spirited Pete Wilson era rule that had been in effect for a couple of decades, was finally eliminated. Senator Holly Mitchell fought that fight, great fight, for a significant amount of time. So we did a lot, and I think that sort of momentum is exciting. That being said, again, to a large extent, people consider budgetary politics to be a zero-sum game, and I'm quite certain that there are folks in other fields who are going to say, well, the ECE folks got theirs last year, it's time for us to get ours this year. So keep the pressure on.
I want to apologize to those of you who had questions that we didn't get to. Our time is running out. I want to let you know that to the extent possible, the panelists will be here for a little bit. Some of us have to run. I also want to acknowledge and point out my staff, who, if you didn't get a question, can't get to folks, talk to them. We'll make sure to get you an answer at some point. Start with Andrew Berthelsen, who has been... Andrew is currently my district director. He's been part of my staff team going back to the days when I was on the Board of Supervisors. We've worked together for 10 years. So thank you, Andrew. Leslie Boblik, who was... handled the mic so well. And finally, a person in my district office who handles education policy and communications, but has immersed herself in education work, and I think has found a real passion in this policy area. Francesca Segre, who put this together. Thank you. Let me give each of you an opportunity to make one final comment. Ted, anything left to say?
Just that my tears for you leaving office has matched my excitement with our great speaker. And then just the last quick thing, since Strong Start and Big Lift were mentioned, this and our great county superintendent, Ann Campbell, this is going to take some support from the federal government, local efforts, and state government, because the needs are so immense. So it's local, state, and feds. Thank you, Rich.
Kathy.
So I would just like to, on behalf of the local Child Care Planning Council in Santa Clara County and the Title V Provider Network, of which I chair in Santa Clara County, I want to give a big thank you to Assemblyman Gordon. He has been not only a champion for our field, but when we have legislative breakfasts and forums and we ask folks to come and talk to us about the field and what's important from a legislator's perspective, he has always been at the table and always been of support. So the local planning council thought it was appropriate to provide some pieces of fine children's literature that we have signed, the local planning council and the Title V providers have signed. And to remind him of his days in the legislature, we'd like to present Where the Wild Things Are. And as he moves forward into the future, as we know, we hope that we continue to have an ally in this field. But he has been the most giving professional that we could ever ask for. He's a wonderful mentor and example to us who advocate on behalf of our families. So we got the giving tree for him because he's always giving to our field, and we're very thankful. So thank you very much.
Speaker Rendon.
I hadn't realized this was going to be Rich's last event. So as far as early childhood education, I'll say it's great. Let's fully fund it. Now let's talk about Rich Gordon. I've said this before. In the assembly, we have a great health program. If you're feeling ill, you have a cold, some sort of physical ailment, we have a health system where you can go see a doctor and feel better. If you have a toothache or a cavity, you can go see a dentist through our oral health program and get that fixed. If you have a problem, you're not quite sure what to do, sort of suffering from a crisis, you just go to Rich Gordon's office and talk through it with him. He has been someone who has been, where the wild things are is appropriate. There are a lot of crises in the legislature, and over the past 4 years, there has not been a crisis that I've gone through in the legislature that didn't lead me into Rich's office. So I'm really going to miss him, but I know that just as his relationship with you will continue, his friendship and relationship with me will continue as well. Love you very much, Rich.
Thank you. It has been an honor and a privilege to serve and to represent this community. You've given me a great gift. I want to do one final thing, and I want to honor others in this room who serve us so exceedingly well. And I'd like to ask the members of school boards who are here today, and please stand and be recognized so we can give you a round of applause for your work on behalf of our children. We value your service, so thank you. With that, we will conclude the Education Forum. Thank you all for being here, and those of you who have watched us or will watch us on Mid-Peninsula Television, thank you for joining us also.
Have watched or will watch.